Hello everybody. This video is for people who want to do it yourself grid tie solar install. If you're kind of a cheap and frugal like me, you don't want to pay a company 10,000 bucks to put one on your roof. So I installed like a 10 kW system at my house on a couple 3 arrays and did most of the work myself. So I want to give you some kind of tips that I've learned along the way to help you out. Alright, so the first tip is the way to get approval from your electric company for this solar system. And I live in Missouri and I'm out in a rural area, so my electric cooperative sent me out an application. I called them up, they sent me out an application, and this application had to be signed off on by an electrician or electrical engineer. So, and in that packet, they required something called a single line diagram, which is basically like one sheet overview of what your system is going to look like. They wanted photographs of where you're going to put the panels on the house. They wanted photographs of where the inverters are going to go. They wanted photographs of where the disconnect would go for the system. And in my case, the pole is a little bit of distance from the house where the meter is. In the cities, the meter is sometimes attached to the side of the house, but where I live, the meter's a few yards away, so you have to bury, this wire from the inverter to the pole, to the disconnect, and then from the pole back into the house, which is sort of a pain, but that's the way they want to do it. Even though the inverter would shut down in case of a grid failure, they want their line people to be able to come out to your pole and kill the power there also if they sense something. So anyway, that's the situation there. So here's an example of the website where you can get the single line diagram done. And anyway, hopefully that'll help, and we'll move on to tip number 2. Alright, so here's the website, solardesigntool.com, and it's like 50 bucks, to get like a month or something, but you can get, a free light version of it, and they'll make the single line drawing for you. Okay, and here's an example of kind of what this single line diagram looks like. Next thing I like to talk about is ground mount versus mounting on the roof. So I have both, and it is a lot easier to do a ground mount than a roof mount, and that's what I would recommend. You can see in some of these pictures of us putting panels on the roof of my shop, and it's slick, it's high, it's at an angle, and if you have to do any repairs, like I had a ground fault for instance because I didn't have one of the MC4 connectors pushed in all the way, and I had to go up there and track it down, and it was such a pain in the ass to get up there. So to me, if you got the space for it, the ground mount is a much better way to go. And I've got both, and I wouldn't do a roof mount again here, but I know if you live in the city or if you have limited space, that wouldn't be an option. But anyway, so I recommend a ground mount. Alright, so the next thing is how these panels face. Here where I live, like 30 degrees I think is kind of the good happy medium on the panel angle. I think in the winter time it goes a lot steeper, and in the summertime it goes a little narrower, but I don't want to go out there and adjust the panels every season to get the most out of it. I just kind of want to sit it and forget it. And these panels have to face true south. If you get the compass out on your phone and go to south, that's pretty good, but that's magnetic south. True south is a few degrees difference. But so if you get out your compass on your phone or a compass and shoot it south and put your panels at 30 degrees here in Missouri, that's pretty good, kind of a set it and forget it deal. Alright, so the next thing I want to talk about is conduit. So my tip to you guys, I wish that someone would have told me this, is to put in bigger conduit than you think you need. Just because the wires are such a pain in the ass to pull through it if the conduit is too small, you know. So in the beginning I was using the inch conduit, and I was trying to put like, four 10 gauge wires through it, and it's just a pain. So if you can use inch and a quarter, inch and a half, 2 inch, whatever the biggest you can afford, that you want to, it'll just make your install so much easier. I mean, trust me on this. So anyway, that's it about conduit. All right, so the next thing is about these boxes outdoors. Like, you can see a picture here of my disconnect. Okay, so if you go to Home Depot or Lowe's or Menards or whatever, and you get one of these boxes, the cheapest ones are the indoor boxes, but the electrician won't sign off on this deal unless you get these NEMA 3 outdoor enclosures. So all these boxes have to be like outdoor rated, and they're about twice as much when they're outdoor rated. Like, for instance, the 30 amp disconnect that's indoor rated is like $35, but the outdoor rated one is like $70. So it's about double the price, but that's what you got to do when you're mounting these boxes outside and these disconnects. So that's all I wanted to say about that. So let's move on to the next thing. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is wire for the DC side, and that's the wire that runs from your panels to your inverter. Okay, so that wire has to be outdoor rated, and I found that in all my studies and with the electricians, expertise, that this wire called THHN wire is the wire to use because it's outdoor rated and you can put it in conduit if you want. So if you need to bury it or whatever. So my recommendation is to use the same size wire that comes with like the pre-made commercially available MC4 wire, which is 12 gauge or 10 gauge. So all my stuff is 10 gauge. But what the electrician told me is if you got a really long run and you're carrying a lot of voltage through it, you might want to consider bigger wire. For instance, my run is 20 yards and he said that 10 gauge is fine, and he had some sort of math. But he said if I was to put panels on another building and bring those wires into my house like I was planning on doing, that's a 100-yard run, and he said I would have to go to 8 gauge THHN wire to do that. So the panels just have a positive and negative, so really you only need 2 wires, but we run a third one for grounding the array. And these THN wires, you can get them in all the colors in the rainbow basically. I used black and red and green, and so that's all I got to say about the DC side of the wire. Use THHN wire, use regular copper wire, don't use copper clad aluminum wire. I know it's more expensive, like wire is one of the most expensive parts of the whole project, but it is what it is. This thing's going to be up there for 20 years. You got to spend the extra $100 to buy the good stuff. Okay, well, we'll move on to the next thing. All right, next tip is wire for the AC side, and that's the wire that runs from the inverter into your house panel. Okay, in my case, the AC coming out of my inverter, I had to run out to the pole to a disconnect and then back into the house panel, which you have to bury it in conduit. So the wire that my electrician told me I had to use is called UF wire, and I'll put up here an example of it. But anyway, it's this really thick coated gray wire, and it's heavy. So in my application, he told me that my run was short enough to where I could go out from my inverter, which I have inside my house, to the pole, back into my breaker box with 10 gauge wire. And that's solid wire. Like the THHN wire, for the panels is, braided. But this wire that I used was solid core. And, it's 10-3 with ground, so there's like 4 wires in there, 2 hots and, a neutral and a ground. If you go up to the next size, I believe 8 or 6 UF underground feeder wire, it starts to get braided at that point, so it can be bent. But anyway, so that's the kind of wire you need, and you can put it in conduit underground. Now, it doesn't have to be in conduit, it can be direct burial according to what the electrician said, but I wanted to put it in conduit because I'm always driving over my property and land and stuff with like heavy equipment, and I just wanted more protection, so I put it in conduit. But anyway, so that's all I got to say about that, and let's move on to the next thing. Alright, so the next thing is elevating the wires off the roof. You can see in some of these pictures, like, my wife's out there cleaning these panels off, and you can see that these some of these wires are laying on the roof in conduit. So the wires, they don't have to be put in conduit. Those DC wires, that run from the panels, those MC4 types. But if you're going to put them into conduit, you can't seal them up. The electrician said that those wires get hot and they could cook, whatever, and they can't be on the roof deck. And I got a metal roof, so what he approved for me to do is I drilled holes in the bottom of that conduit, and basically the conduit is just to keep the sun off of the insulation material, and it's really not to waterproof it because those MC4 connectors and that wire is already waterproof. So I ended up running it through these PVCs, and I got holes drilled in the bottom of them so any water will just drain right out, and for ventilation. So I'm just basically using those pieces of pipe, like I said, as a protection from the sun. And you can also coil those wires up and zip tie them to the bottom, but you got to keep them off the roof deck. None of those wires can be touching the roof because they get hot and there's a chance for fire according to the electrician. So raise the panels off the roof. He told me to keep the panels off the roof 2 inches, and he said none of the wires can be touching the roof. So anyway, that's my advice on that, and we'll move on to the next thing. Okay, the next thing is DC disconnects. Okay, these are specialized disconnects, so you can't just go buy a normal battery disconnect for 12 volts or whatever cheap off eBay. You got to buy these specialized disconnects that are rated for the voltage. You can't use an AC disconnect. It has to be a DC rated deal. And the way the electrician explained it to me is that DC will arc, like a welder, between like your electrode on your welder and the ground on your welder, like has this big arc. And so the DC disconnects are specialized disconnects, and they gotta shut fast. So they're a lot more expensive, but you have to buy these DC disconnects. And in my case, they wanted one on the roof that'll disconnect the arrays from the inverter, and so I had to buy these, and I bought mine, their IMO brand or whatever. There's a guy on eBay, Engineer775, he's got a channel, and that's what he uses, and he seems like he's really knowledgeable, and he puts up systems all over the country. So that's what I ordered, and the electrician said it was fine because it was rated for the 400 volts that I was running through it, so I have 3 strings, and I had to get 3 of them, and they're like 50 or 60 bucks a piece, but you got to buy it. So anyway, that's what I wanted to tell you about DC disconnects. You got to buy the right ones, and they're more expensive, but you can't use AC disconnects, and you can't use 12 volt disconnects when you're running 400 volts through it. All right, well, we'll move on to the next thing. So this might seem like it's a little bit out of order, but the next thing I want to talk about is waiting to turn this on. You got to wait until the electric company comes out and puts in your net meter. They'll do a brief inspection, they'll put in your production meters. It's after the electrician signs off on it. So from my understanding, if you turn this thing on before that net meter's put in, that meter will read the power going in and going out. So it's like you're being double charged, for the power you're producing, because it doesn't sense which way it's going. It just knows electricity is moving through it. And anyway, so that's my advice, is to wait to turn this thing on until the electric company comes out and puts in the meter. And in my case, when they came out to put in the meter, they made sure that the disconnect worked, and they made sure when the grid power was shut down that the inverter shut down. They made sure the safeties were in place before they finally popped in the meter and left. So anyway, well, let's move on to the next thing. Okay, so the next topic is choosing the kind of inverter. They make these micro inverters that you put on every panel, and I have a string inverter, actually a couple of them. But anyway, these string inverters is that you put all the panels power directly into the inverter. These micro inverters, they're daisy chained together, but they're like a separate unit that gets put on the track outside, and those are more efficient. They're solar optimizers also. But anyway, in my case, if you're doing it yourself, a string inverter is a lot easier because it's less wiring outside, and there's less things that can go wrong. In my case, if something goes wrong, the inverter might go out in 10 years, and I just pop in a new inverter and switch out 6 wires and I'm done. With these microinverters, you'd have to get back on the roof if one of the microinverters goes out, pull that panel out, pull the microinverter out. I know they're more efficient, and you can track them better. If you're like a nerd who likes to track what each panel does over the course of a day, a week, a year, or hour, or hourly, or whatever you want to do, you probably want to get those micro inverters. You can track shade and things like that through all these apps. But for me, in a do-it-yourself situation, these string inverters just uncomplicate things. And anyway, so that's that. And there's probably a big debate on YouTube on what's the best thing to do. But for me, my choice was just a basic string inverter. Okay, so the placement of the inverter. Now, for instance, this Solar City inverter that I got is outdoor rated, but I have it indoors. So just keep in mind that these things make a lot of heat when they're pumping out. Like when this thing's pumping out like 5,000 watts or whatever, it creates a fair amount of heat on there. But I figured I'd rather have it indoors than out, just to keep the weather off of it, because that's one of the most expensive parts of the deal. It's like $650 for one of those units. So anyway, just wanted to warn you that these inverters put out a little bit of heat, and that's a little bit of a tip whenever you decide where you want to put your inverter. Okay, so the last topic is overpaneling. Now, where I live, I'm a redneck. I'm in a redneck area, and solar is not cool, right? People like kind of make fun of you, like they think you're a liberal hippie or something if you got solar on your roof. So I decided to kind of hide my panels, and so I have them on the back of the house. They're not facing the south on one of my arrays, and my house doesn't even face north and south. So my panels are not getting 30 degrees, and they're not getting south facing benefit. So in my case, the thing is I over panel. For instance, I have a 6,000 watt inverter, but I got 8,000 watts worth of panels on it. And I talked to Missouri Wind and Solar, and all the experts that I could, and a certified solar installer, and they said you can over panel as much as you want, that the inverter is only going to do what it's going to do. So that's what I had to do to kind of compensate for not having them in the right place. So feel free to over panel all you want, and so that's my recommendation on that. And then also I added some places where I buy cheap stuff, from Santan Solar and Signature Solar. They're eBay sellers and they have their own store, but they're really good to use. I'm not affiliated with them or anything, but I bought a lot of stuff from them. All right, so that's my tips. I hope some of this helped you out, and have a good day.